You're listening to In the Balance, an Iowa Judicial Branch podcast. Welcome back. May marked the 20th anniversary of the Iowa Judicial Branch building's opening. In honor of the anniversary, I sat down with Rebecca Colton and David Boyd, two past Iowa Judicial Branch employees who were a part of the building process from start to finish. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for talking with me today. Before we get into your role in the planning of the Iowa Judicial Branch building, tell me a bit about your time at the branch and where you are now.
Well, I began working for the Iowa Supreme Court in the late 80s. I worked for 5 chief justices over a period of 25 years. I wasn't involved in the work on cases. Instead, I helped each Chief Justice with a variety of administrative duties. And then I retired about 10 years ago.
And you were a part of the building team during your time there as well for what would become the Iowa Judicial Branch building back in the late 1990s. Who were some of your fellow team members and what tasks did you take on?
Well, the team was headed up by Justice Lavarado and included Justice Turnus, State Court Administrator Bill O'Brien, Assistant State Court Administrator David Boyd, and later we added Jim Evans, who became the building manager, and myself.
And when starting this process, what was the motivation for moving into the standalone building?
Well, that's an interesting history because when I began work with the court in the late 80s, the topic first came to my attention from, a handful of different legislators who were eager to talk to the court about moving out of the State House so that the legislature could have more room for its growing staff and needs. At the time, the Supreme Court was not interested in the topic. Many of the members opposed the idea of leaving the State House because they thought it was an appropriate place for the court to be housed in the same building with the 2 other branches of government. It helped build collegiality. It was symbolic, and for those reasons and others, the court was not interested in moving out of the Capitol. That changed, I'd say, about 10 years later. Not only had the membership of the court changed, but also the judicial branch had changed immensely because in the late 80s and early 90s, the Iowa legislature approved a significant reorganization of the state court system and brought the operation of the state courts, the district courts, the county courts, under one umbrella, essentially managed by the with oversight by the Iowa Supreme Court and the State Court Administrator. So after that reorganization, the personnel needed to operate the administration of the state court system increase significantly. The courts also added a lot of staff when the courts became computerized. And so by the late 90s, we had 4 or 5 rented offices around downtown Des Moines, in addition to the offices in the Capitol. The courts had outgrown the Capitol space. There wasn't enough room for all the employees. Conference rooms were scarce. And at that point, the legislature did approach the court again and offered to pay for a new building so that it could take over the court space in the State House.
And when starting this process, once it was approved and brought to you by the legislature, as a part of that building team, when searching for architects and approving designs, what traits were you looking for?
The primary focus was to find a design team, an architect that had experience designing and building courthouses. Mm-hmm. And that's really what we focused on. And I think a handful of architects were interviewed, and they had all worked on courthouse projects.
And once you had the architect chosen, how collaborative was the design process?
Oh, it was extremely collaborative. The architect, countless meetings with the design team, first to talk about, just the concept and what did the court want as far as design features and style and space. And there was an analysis of the space needs, present and future. And so many meetings with the architects, their engineers, others involved in the process. And the architects were very good about listening to the ideas offered by the team, and also they welcomed feedback. So there was a lot of back and forth during the design process.
And not counting the 10 years from when the legislature first brought the idea of a standalone building to the court, how long did the process take, the design, the construction, from beginning to end?
Well, if my memory serves me right, I think it was 4 or 5 years, perhaps.
And lastly, you began your career working at the State Capitol building, and you retired after moving into the new Judicial Branch building. What was that transition like, and were there benefits to that new building space that you hadn't expected after going through the planning process?
Well, I think the move itself went fairly smoothly. There was an adjustment for a lot of employees who had worked at the Capitol for their whole careers. But I think the transition went smoothly. And as far as the benefits, there were a lot of advantages when one compares the new building to what the court's quarters were in the State House. Many more conference rooms, many more offices. In fact, there were spaces designed to handle growth in the staff, growth in personnel, more judges and staff. The building also was designed to start out with 2 courtrooms, and there's space for a 3rd courtroom if the need ever arises, or there's some desire for that space, or it could be turned into something else. Oh, I would say also, I think from the public aspect, there was plenty of space, and there are plenty of public rooms now to facilitate public education programs and tours of the building. The advantage of having the conference rooms, additional conference rooms, and an auditorium helped with that. And it also allowed the Judicial Branch for the first time to consolidate all of the offices and staff who were working around Des Moines in leased properties. So we brought them all into the Judicial Branch, which offered many benefits.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Rebecca. I appreciate you giving me some insight into the history of this building.
Well, you're welcome. It's nice to talk with you.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today, David. To get started, tell me a bit about your time at the Judicial Branch and where you are now.
Sure, Marissa. I'm happy to be with you today. Frankly, I'm very fortunate. I worked in the Iowa Judicial Branch for 40 years, nearly my entire professional career. I arrived in Iowa in 1977 as the district court administrator, the first district court administrator for the 3rd Judicial District in Northwest Iowa. In 1984, then State Court Administrator Bill O'Brien asked me to join the State Court Administrator's office as the Deputy State Court Administrator, where I was primarily responsible for the implementation of the transition of our court system from a system previously funded by local property taxes to a state-funded system. I continued to serve as the Deputy State Court Administrator until May 2003, when I was appointed State Court Administrator following Mr. O'Brien's retirement. I retired from the Judicial Branch in September 2017, and although I was born and raised in Southern California, having lived in Iowa now for more than half of my life, I consider myself an Iowan by choice. So I currently live in retirement in Johnston with my wife, Nancy.
Great. And during your time at the Judicial Branch, you also found yourself as the liaison for the Iowa Supreme Court to begin discussions with legislators about constructing what would become the Iowa Judicial Branch building. And prior to that building opening in 2003, the Iowa Supreme Court had been at the Capitol for over 100 years. So when did this discussion to move to a standalone building begin, and what sparked it? What inspired it?
For starters, the discussion that led up to the building of what is now the Judicial Branch building was not the first time that there had been discussions about space in the Capitol. So let me add a little historical perspective. For the first 100 years or so of the Capitol's existence, all 3 branches of state government, the legislature, the executive, and judicial branches, were represented in the Capitol building. And by executive branch, I mean not only the governor, but also the other statewide elected officials: the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Attorney General, the State Treasurer, and the State Auditor. As state government evolved over the years, space began to get quite tight in the Capitol. Consequently, there were conversations from time to time between the leaders of all 3 branches of government. Throughout all of those discussions and conversations, the Supreme Court took the position that all 3 branches should be represented in the Capitol, and therefore the court would not leave the Capitol. Eventually, there were discussions in the 1970s that led to a space agreement between the 3 branches. The legislature, the governor, and the Supreme Court remained in the Capitol building. The Attorney General and Secretary of Agriculture moved out of the Capitol into other space on the Capitol complex. And while the primary office of the State Treasurer, State Auditor, and Secretary of State remained in the Capitol, much of their support staff was relocated to other space on the Capitol complex. Over the next 20 years or so, there were conversations, once again mostly informal, about how to resolve the space issues in the Capitol. For example, in 1976, the Iowa Court of Appeals was created, which required space. In the 1980s and maybe into the early 90s, there were some studies done regarding the possibility of building an office building for legislative and other support staff somewhere in the vicinity of the Capitol. Even one suggestion being to build an office building underground.
Wow.
And the legislature's partisan and nonpartisan staffs had continued to grow. To provide more space for legislative staff, offices had been created in what was referred to as the mezzanine space between the upper floors in the Capitol. So in other words, it was like double decking. You couldn't see it from inside the Capitol rotunda, but behind the walls, it was like double decking of office space.
Okay.
Finally, the state fire marshal stepped in and indicated that those offices were a fire hazard. And that's when a group of legislative leaders and a representative from the governor's office came to me to initiate a serious discussion about the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, State Court Administrator's office vacating the Capitol building. Basically, legislative leaders said they were willing to do almost anything that was reasonable, including funding a standalone building, if the court would vacate the Capitol. The court said it needed more information in order to make an educated decision. Among other things, the court wanted money immediately to conduct a space needs analysis and to study various sites on the Capitol complex on which to locate the building if one were to be built. The legislature provided those initial study funds, and we began to move forward in earnest.
And what were some of the biggest hurdles you faced in getting the construction of the judicial branch building approved?
Frankly, there weren't very many hurdles.
Good. Good to hear.
At least not once the court agreed to vacate the Capitol if its specific demands were met. And that was probably the biggest hurdle. Mm-hmm. That is getting the court to agree to vacate the Capitol, especially for some members of the court at that time who had previously been through other space discussions about Capitol space, and it was very difficult for them to think about vacating the Capitol. But that was really probably the biggest hurdle that we faced, or that the legislature faced, getting the court to agree to vacate the Capitol. Once we did all of the background work that the court had requested and the legislature had funded, a majority of the court did vote to proceed with an agreement to vacate our space in the Capitol as long as certain conditions were met. Now, if I could insert here, there was one rather large hurdle during construction over which we had no control. A dock strike in Italy. Now, you might wonder, how could that have impacted the construction of the judicial branch building? You have to understand that most of the marble in the judicial branch building came from Italy or Pakistan. And unfortunately, some of the marble was held up because of a dock strike. So construction of the building, which was anticipated originally to take 24 months, was closer to 28 months, but mostly on account of the Italian dock strike. And speaking of strikes, at one point during the construction process, the master contract for construction workers in the Des Moines area was up for negotiation. And there was a time when it was thought that there might actually be a strike, that they wouldn't get a new agreement, and there might be a strike. Fortunately, that didn't happen. A new contract was put in place in time to keep the construction process moving forward.
And speaking of construction and that phase of this process, how did you and your team decide on the building's location, which now sits across Court Avenue to the south of the Capitol building?
Part of the initial funding for studies that was provided by the legislature was used to conduct a site review done by architects that we hired of several sites on the Capitol complex where a new building might be located, as well as a review of what I refer to as the old historical building, which is technically known as the Ola Babcock building. The reason for studying the potential use of the Babcock building was because the old historical building had been vacated because there was the new historical building at that time. And it was thought that maybe if that building was given to the judicial branch and totally gutted inside, we could design that building for use by the Supreme Court and our administrative offices. So that's why it was included in the review of sites where we might build a standalone new building. The space we finally chose was clearly the most logical place for the building based on the information we received from our experts. And if you view the Capitol complex from downtown, particularly if you're in one of the buildings where you can get up several stories and look to the east at the Capitol, it becomes quite obvious that having the building where it is, the symmetry between the old historical building, the Capitol, and what is now the Judicial Branch building is just absolutely perfect. It becomes quite obvious. However, the specific location actually became one of those tense moments in the whole process. In fact, it could have put the kibosh on the whole project. We have what's known here in Iowa as the Capitol Complex Planning Commission. This commission, made up of individuals appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Iowa Senate, has the ultimate authority over where any buildings or monuments are constructed on the Capitol complex. And it turned out that a former head of the state's General Services Agency, who had been involved in some of the space battles back in the 1970s, made a strenuous objection to our site selection. But fortunately, the presentation made by our consultants carried the day, and the Planning Commission voted to approve our request. I think almost everyone involved in this, whether they were from the legislative branch or the executive branch, and certainly us, agreed that this was clearly the best site if we were going to build a new building.
And going back to the construction phase and the design process, you were also a part of that team. What was your role in that process? Was there anything that you wanted to see specifically in the building that either made it or did not make it into the final iteration?
The court appointed a committee to oversee the design, development, and the construction process. The committee consisted of Justice Louis Lavarado, Justice Marcia Turnus, State Court Administrator William O'Brien, executive assistant to the Chief Justice, Becky Colton, and me. And we worked as a team throughout the entire process, including the hiring of our architectural team, the general contractor, et cetera, et cetera. And early on in the process, we hired Jim Evans as our internal construction manager with the thought that once the building was completed, Jim would stay on as our facilities manager since he would know the building better than anyone. And so Jim became part of the team, and since he's still here today, it worked out pretty well.
I'd say so.
So anyway, I had the privilege of participating in the entire process, including all of the logistics, not only of moving those of us who were still housed in the Capitol to the new building, but also to move our administrative staff like finance, personnel, IT, planning, and others that were located in leased space in downtown Des Moines. I think we had maybe 6 different leased office spaces of administrative staff that came back into the new Judicial Branch building. I think it was one of the best times that I had in that process was the initial design of the building, because the architects put you through a pretty rigorous process if you've ever gone through something like that. And it's not like you can just all of a sudden say, well, I'd like it to look like this or like that or whatever. You have to reach what are your design goals, and then they can take from that and develop potential options for what a building might look like. And so just for example, something that I wouldn't have thought of prior but made a whole lot of sense once I was in the process, we didn't start out with the idea of building a building that had an atrium in the middle of it, the light court, as we called it. We didn't start out with, let's have a building that has an atrium. The atrium in the middle of the Judicial Branch building comes from a very simple concept, and that is we wanted everybody, not just the people with offices with windows on the outside of the building, but all of the people who also had offices on the inside of the building. We wanted everyone to have access to natural lighting, because that's one of those things that is very important to having a workspace where people want to come to work every day. And so that worked out quite well. I think that, for the most part, we wanted to build something at the time that was pretty much state of the art, and that could adapt over time so that it could continue to be state of the art, in spite of the fact that it was in a very traditional looking building.
And lastly, now that we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the opening of the Judicial Branch building, what do you hope members of the public take away from their visit to the building?
That's a really good question, and it's a very important question. First and foremost, I hope they leave with a clear understanding that the building represents the home of a strong and independent branch of Iowa state government. The building was not built just to be another office building on the Capitol complex. It was built to be a 100-year building. While it was not built to compete with the Capitol, it was built to complement the Capitol building. It was very important to our building committee to have links to the court's time in the Capitol. This is evidenced mostly by the historic allegorical murals that once upon a time were on the ceiling inside the courtroom in the Capitol, and that were restored and are placed in various locations in the new building. You can also see a connection back to the Capitol. If you stand anywhere in the rotunda, on any floor of the rotunda, and look at the designs that are beneath the railing on each floor of the new building, the designs on those designs are all different designs, but they're designs of items that the architects found in the Capitol. And they replicated those designs just so that it would add to our desire to have that connection of the Capitol with the Judicial Branch building. I also hope that when people leave the building after being there, that they leave with a sense that this was a building that represents a wise use of what were precious resources when all three branches of government worked together toward a common goal. Even 20 years ago, when we first moved into the building and people came and took tours and they asked how much it cost, and we told them it was built for $30 million. And it came in it came in under budget and pretty much on time. People had a hard time believing that. It looked like it cost a lot more than we were able to do with the money that the legislature provided. And incidentally, the money that constructed that building did not come out of the general fund of state government. The money that funded the building came from two sources. It came from excess lottery profits through the infrastructure appropriation, and also from the tobacco settlement case where Iowa received substantial funds from cigarette manufacturers a number of years ago. So there were no general fund dollars that went into the actual construction of that building. And then finally, I hope that when they leave with a sense of pride in the rich history of the Iowa Supreme Court, which over the years has been out front on so many different issues when it comes to state court systems in our country. And it's such a rich history that we need to be very proud of.
Very well said, David. Thank you so much again for taking the time to talk to me today.
You are more than welcome.
You've been listening to In the Balance, an Iowa Judicial Branch podcast, hosted and produced by Marissa Gaal. If you would like more information about Iowa's courts, you can visit www.iowacourts.gov. You can also follow the Iowa Judicial Branch on Twitter and YouTube at Iowa Courts. This episode of In the Balance is now adjourned.